Still talking about the resurrection today, still talking about naturalistic theories that try to explain the resurrection away, reading through evidence that demands a verdict. And today specifically, we're talking about the theft theory. So the theft theory is that someone, either some random person came in, stole Jesus' body, maybe for something like magical incantations or something, or maybe one of Jesus' followers, maybe one of Jesus' disciples come in and stole the body and then went about preaching Jesus resurrected even though they knew it was a lie. So this theory is really propagated by Richard Carey, or at least that's the person Sean notes when it comes to the theft theory. And he goes even further to talk about the guards. So whenever someone says that someone stole the body, the Christian will say, well, what about the guards? So Richard Carey's response to that about the guards was that the guard wasn't placed there until late Saturday. So this would have given plenty of time for some random person or one of the disciples to come in and steal the body. He goes on to say no one checked to see if the tomb was already empty, given that maybe when the guard was placed there the tomb was already empty, so it really wouldn't have mattered anyways. Closed tomb simply had a guard and seal placed on it, implying that even if the guard story is true, it does little to argue about the theft of the body, Jesus' body being taken. He even goes on to say furthermore, and this is kind of a good argument, it's recorded in the Bible that the guards, they took a bribe. So when they discovered the tomb was empty, they were scared. They went to the Jewish authorities, and the Jewish authorities gave them money and said, say that the disciples stole the body. So Richard Carey saying that it's obvious that they were willing to take a bribe. So perhaps one of the disciples came to the guards, said they gave him money, and the guards just kind of turned a blind eye, let the disciples stole the body, and then perhaps even furthermore went to the Jewish authorities, got paid 2 times from the Jewish authorities. So in response specifically to the guards, so the Jewish authorities, they went to Pilate to have a guard posted at the tomb. This gives us a high confidence that, or at least they were confident that Jesus' body was still in there. Otherwise, why go through the trouble of asking Pilate for a guard? Secondly, the stone that covered the tomb could only be placed there by a Roman guard legally. So what would have happened? The Roman guard would have gotten there. They would have inspected the tomb, make sure that none of the evidence had been tampered with, aka Jesus' body, and then they would have came out and then sealed the tomb in place. And then I thought that when they said seal the tomb, that just meant that the boulder basically was covering up the cave or the hole, but the seal is actually like a seal from the Roman government. So the Roman government or a Roman guard would have went in there, checked to make sure that Jesus' body was still there. It could only have been done by a guard. It could only have been sealed by a guard, and so they would have stretched this cord across the rock and then fastened it at either end with these clay tacks that had signets of the Roman governor, and this could only be done by a guard. So if Jesus' body had not been there when they done this, obviously they would have suspected foul play. Somebody would have been in trouble. And then lastly, the fact that the idea that the guards took a bribe from the followers to turn a blind eye and allow them to come in and steal the body, the reason this doesn't hold up is because A, they would have been court-martialed definitely. B, they would have probably lost their life. And C, one of the ways that they lost their life, one of the ways that they were punished, is they were literally burned alive in their clothes. Excuse me, but if you ask me, am I willing to take a bribe, and as a consequence, there's a possibility I'm going to be burned alive in my clothes? No, thank you. Not going to happen. Now, in response to the theft theory by one of the followers or one of the disciples specifically, so the theory that one of the disciples or multiple disciples conspired together, they stole the body and then went about preaching Jesus resurrected as their central message, even though they knew it was a lie. Sean argues the reason this theory doesn't hold up is because usually people, they buckle under pressure. Conspiracies like this, they usually fall apart by, one person is usually willing to, when you're facing jail time, you're facing being arrested, you're facing beatings and torture. I mean, there's people that argue that we don't know for sure that the disciples, they died for their faith, but we can be pretty sure that they were at least persecuted. I mean, we've all seen episodes of the first 48. You know that person's about to give in and tell when they ask for a cigarette and a cup of coffee or a cup of water. Likewise, the disciples, they would have been facing jail time. They would have been facing pressure. I mean, if they went through all of that, knowing that they were just lying about Jesus being resurrected, I mean, kudos to them. That's pretty powerful in and of itself. Now, I'm not saying that's what happened. I do think Jesus resurrected, and they believe that Jesus resurrected, and then that's why we have Christianity to this day. The data shows us that the disciples' lives were radically transformed after Jesus is resurrected. Furthermore, a story propagated by the disciples, saying they stole the body and then they went about preaching Jesus resurrected, this wouldn't have convinced the notorious church leader Paul. Paul, the same Paul who killed Christians. What would have caused him to make that 180, that shift? He was a high-ranking Jewish, part of the Sanhedrin. What would have made him go from, murdering Christians to all of a sudden being one himself? And then furthermore, you have the skeptic James. What would have caught if the disciples stole the body? This wouldn't have convinced James, who obviously rejected Jesus prior to the resurrection, himself. Then you have the response to the theft by some random dude who maybe used the body for magical incantations or someone like that. So this theory says that someone else other than the disciples stole the body, and then the disciples, they come in, they discover that the tomb was empty. Now all of a sudden they believe Jesus resurrected, and this could have led to them thinking that they seen him risen, or thinking that they seen him in the sky, things like that. The reason this kind of falls apart is this wouldn't have convinced Paul. It wasn't the empty tomb that convinced Paul. It was Paul believing that he had seen the risen Jesus. Secondly, we just talked about him, James. It wasn't until after the resurrection. He believes that he's seen Jesus, alive and well. That's what convinced him Jesus had risen, not the empty tomb. And then you also have the followers themselves. The empty tomb didn't really convince anyone Jesus had been risen. You have Mary Magdalene. When she discovered the empty tomb, she immediately thought someone stole the body. You have Peter, who wasn't convinced by the empty tomb. You have doubting Thomas, who wasn't convinced by the empty tomb. I mean, these show that it's recorded in the Bible. It wasn't the empty tomb that led them to believe Jesus risen. It was the appearances themselves. And this also leads us to think that these people were of sound mind. They're thinking logically, because if you or I was to discover an empty tomb, we wouldn't immediately jump to Jesus resurrected. We'd probably be thinking someone stole the body or something like that. So it wasn't the empty tomb, it was the appearances themselves that convinced people that Jesus resurrected. 4, even if it is true that someone stole the body, this doesn't account for the appearances themselves. Also have the problems with the disciples, the lack of courage. So, before Jesus was arrested, or right when Jesus was being resurrected and being tried by Pilate, they scatter, they fear for their lives, they deny Jesus. So what would have made them go, or what could have caused them to make this shift to go from being scared disciples, scared for their lives, to all of a sudden being willing to face down a Roman guard, steal that body of Jesus, and then go about preaching Jesus resurrected, even though they knew it was a lie? Doesn't really hold up. And then you also have the resurrection itself was not expected by the followers. It wasn't expected by neither Jew nor Gentile. There was no Second Temple Jewish text that expressly written that there was going to be a resurrected Messiah. So no one expected that Jesus was going to come about or come alive. It wasn't until after the resurrection is when they started to kind of understand what Jesus was talking about when he was alive and walking with them. In conclusion, the idea that the disciples would summon the courage to face down a Roman guard, roll that rock back, steal the body, and then go about preaching Jesus resurrected, even though they knew it was a lie, doesn't really hold up.